Please, do it quick.
You don't need to beg for mercy that's already yours. Selling people isn't business. It's rot with a price tag.
I bought her freedom with a coin and found my own in the bargain. Red Ford, Kansas Territory, September 1879. The wind cut like iron filings. It skittered along the wire I was checking and sang a thin, mean note through the staples, like a file dragged over a bad tooth. My hands moved by habit, test the post, tug the strand, set my boot against the brace, and lean, but the day had no mercy to it. The light was white and hard. Grass lay flat as brushed tin. Crows drifted low as if the sky itself had gotten tired and let them loose. I was running fence along the south line where the ground rolls once, then gives up to open. Checking wire is a lonely man's arithmetic. Count the steps, listen for the squeal, keep your mind where your feet are. You don't think about the year you left behind or the names that don't answer anymore. You mind the fence. You keep your word to the land. Red Ford sat 3 miles north, a smear of clapboard and smoke on the Santa Fe spur. Toward noon, the town's noise sometimes rode the wind this far. Hammer rings, a piano missing 2 notes, cattle bawling like they'd dreamed of grass and woke to boards. Today, a rougher sound ran under it. Jeers. Then laughter that didn't belong to the plains. It came thin and sharp, like a tin cup thrown down a well. Something was wrong, something that didn't belong to the land. I stood, dust stiff on my coat. The wire hummed once, then went quiet. The wind took a breath and held it. In that pause, I felt the weight of a choice step onto the scale. A man can look away. He can say the world is wide and sorrow is cheap. The land won't argue, but some sounds get inside your bones and make a home there. I saddled the roan and rode the 2-track toward town. The sun struck off the iron rails and made a silver streak you could follow, like a promise you weren't sure you wanted to keep. As I neared the stock pens, the smell hit hot wood, manure, old whiskey, men who'd forgotten soap. At the far edge, a crowd bunched against a flatbed wagon. They leaned in like dogs around a scrap. On the wagon's deck knelt a woman with her wrists tied, rope chewing the skin raw. Her hair was dark as creek stone after rain. Her dress had been respectable once. Now it clung in torn strips, dust-printed, sun-bleached to shame. But her back stayed straight, her chin held a line. I couldn't see her eyes from the gate, but I felt how she looked past them all, like the horizon was the only thing in this town worth speaking to. A man in a clean black hat, clean the way money stays clean, paraded the wagon, hands wide, voice bigger than his courage. Pike Lathrop, cattle when cattle paid, anything else when sin paid better. I'd seen his brand on hides and his breath on trouble. Educated, he said, can sew up a wound, can read a Bible, eats like a bird, works like a mule. Boys, I'm losing on this one, costs me more than feed. The crowd grinned. A few looked down, ashamed of their own faces, then looked up again because it's harder to look away than folks tell you. She didn't beg. Her mouth was split at the corner and dry as chalk, but when she spoke it came quiet enough. I had to lean a step without meaning to. Please, do it quick. The words landed between boots and dust and did not break. A few men laughed, because courage makes a certain kind of man nervous. I moved closer, hat low, voice lower, hands open. Then I reached into my vest and felt the dollar that lived there for luck, or memory, I hadn't decided which. I didn't believe in luck. Memory's a worse god. But a silver piece can change the weather in a crowd. How much? I asked. Pike looked me over like a butcher looks at a narrow steer. For an old fence man? $1. One honest American dollar. Cheaper than your whiskey, Hart. I didn't look at him again. I set the coin on the barrel by the wheel and let it ring. Then I slid a folded paper toward him. Write your name, I said, so the Lord can read it clean when the law comes asking. He smirked, but it flickered. A few in the crowd shifted, remembering the parts of themselves they'd rather not own. Pike dipped his pen. Time moved slow, like cold molasses down glass. When his name dried, I folded the sheet and put it in my breast pocket, where a man keeps what he won't let the world take. "Get down," I said, not like an order, more like a bridge lowered. "You can walk beside me if you're willing, or you can walk away. Your choice." She stood. The rope burned where it fell. Her legs trembled once, then found the ground. She looked at the crowd, at me, then at the road the wind had drawn across the prairie. The world held its breath. The first drink of water never looks as good as it feels. I handed her my canteen and turned so she could pretend I wasn't watching. She took 2 small swallows and capped it with care. I've seen men gulp mercy and spill it down their shirts. People who intend to live make rations out of hope. We walked from the pens without hurry. The roan stood hip-shot at the hitch rail, pretending to sleep as horses do when they're thinking. I lifted my hat to the marshal out of habit. He was busy being elsewhere with his eyes. I cut the rope from her wrists with the knife I keep for feed sacks and bad decisions. Up close I could read her face better. Cheekbones that made a map. A white scar along the brow. Dust freckles like a painter too fond of his brush. She was younger than the pain she carried, somewhere between 20 and 30. The plain's right age in a tight hand. "My wagon's east," I said. 10 miles. You can ride, or we walk." She studied the roan, then me. "I walk," she said. The words carried the flat cadence of the Cheyenne River in them, and winter. I'd ridden scout enough to know what I was hearing and what I wasn't. She noticed that I noticed. Her chin didn't move, but something behind her eyes shifted 1 notch toward alert instead of braced. "All right." I adjusted the saddle strings, slung my coil, tied the canteen where the sun wouldn't heat it to soup. "Name's Elias Hart." She let it alone for a dozen steps. "Ayanna," she said finally. We took the 2-track along the fence, staying on the short grass, where a snake can't lie without showing half his mind. The day wore its hard face. I kept to my work. Watch the sky, feel the wind change, read the land in the roan's ears. She walked like a hunter's daughter, weight forward, head quiet, hands loose, eyes never where you expect. When a meadowlark flashed from the wire, she turned her head just so, and the look that crossed her mouth wasn't a smile, not quite, but it wasn't nothing either. We said little. Talk's a door you don't open in the first mile. The trail dipped into a swale where the fence stuttered. I fixed a staple while she waited in the shade of a sandplum thicket. She didn't ask to help. She didn't pretend not to see I was favoring the right shoulder I've owed to Chickamauga since I was young enough to be stupid. When the wire sang full again, she looked at my hand. I kept my eyes on the post. We reached the wagon, in time for the sun to decide. It had done enough. I spread a canvas in the bed and set a horse blanket for her to lean. "You can ride up," I said, meaning beside me, not behind. She climbed to the bench and sat with both feet planted, the way you sit when you intend to leave fast, if leaving's required. 10 miles is a long quiet. The wheels counted them. The roan flicked flies with his tail like a metronome marking a thin day. When she spoke, it came without preamble. "You gave $1, she said. "I did." "That buys what?" "Paper. His name where a rope can find it." "And me?" "That buys nothing of you. You were never for sale." "Here?" She watched the road. "Men have said different." A while later, "You will sell me to other men?" "No." Wind took the rest of the light out of the grass and set it where the sky could use it. "You can get down now," I said when the wagon turned toward my place. "If you want the open. But there's more water where I live, and a fire that bides by a man's word." She didn't answer. A coyote wound up a song and threw it at the horizon to see who'd bring it back. By the time the cabin's eaves showed against the last of the day, my shoulder gnawed and my jaw wanted to quit. I unhitched slow. Patience in the last 10 minutes is the same as mercy. Inside, the room held what a life needs and nothing it doesn't. Table, stove, bunk, shelf, coffee pot. I built the fire small. You can always feed a thing later. "I'll wash," I said, holding up the dipper and basin, then set them by the door so she could choose the how of it. While the water heated, I cut bread and pushed the knife toward her. She cut a piece not larger than what a child could hold, and ate it like a woman who intends to wake clear-headed. When she reached for the basin, she paused, waiting to see if I'd turn my head or prove myself another sort of man. I turned. The rope burns on her wrists were angry as hornets. I set the salve on the table and didn't speak. A minute later she set the lid back on the tin. "It helps," she said. I nodded. I brewed coffee that tasted like a fence post and poured hers first. Outside, the wind changed its tune and carried a faint thread of riders, 3, maybe 4. The roan stamped once, then stood too still. Ayanna's eyes lifted. She heard it too. She did not flinch. She set the cup down careful so it wouldn't talk against the wood. "You said I could go," she said. "You still can." Reverie Stewart, Reverie 7. She looked at the door, then at the wall where the rifle hung, because there's no sense pretending a rifle isn't part of a room out here. Then she looked at me. "I will stay," she said. "One night." "That'll do," I said, and felt the old weight settle across my shoulders, the way a good coat does when winter shows its teeth. I banked the fire so it would last. The wind pressed against the cabin like a tired animal. The house did what houses do when asked it, kept faith with those inside. And the riders drew up somewhere out past the cottonwoods and decided what kind of men they were going to be. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The riders never came back before dawn. That didn't make the night shorter. Every board in the cabin had something to say, and the wind translated it poorly. I lay near the door with the rifle ready, and the dog-tired wish that men could believe in sleep the way children do. The fire had burned down to a low, sulking glow, and every time it cracked, my finger twitched near the trigger. Habit does that to a man. Habit and guilt, they share the same boots. When the gray of morning unrolled over the prairie, Ayanna was already outside. She stood ankle-deep in frost, sleeves rolled, hair dark and heavy, breathing like someone counting the world's scars one exhale at a time. She wasn't looking east to greet the sun. She was looking west, where the danger had ridden off. That's the difference between hope and memory. One faces the light, the other counts the shadows behind it. I poured coffee from the blackened pot, the kind that could take paint off a wagon wheel. She came in, silent but for the sound of leather boots drying by the hearth. "You watch long?" I asked. "Long enough to see they still breathe." "Good. Breathing men can still be warned." We ate dry bread and bacon that could have served as roof shingles. She didn't complain. The kind of hunger that follows captivity doesn't make noise, it just learns manners. Every bite was work, but neither of us minded work. It keeps the heart from remembering too loud. The day started like labor, and that's the best kind of mercy. We checked the south fence, patched a split rail, fixed the wagon wheel that had sulked since the last cattle drive. The ground was still hard, frost clinging to the roots, and every nail sang its dull hymn into the wood. She picked up each task as if she'd done it 100 times somewhere else, under different skies. When I handed her a hammer, she used it like punctuation short, certain sentences that didn't waste a single swing. By mid-morning she was humming low, minor notes that rode the wind instead of fighting it. It wasn't a tune I knew, and I didn't ask the words. Every man's got a song he isn't proud of remembering, and maybe every woman does too. When the sun reached its meanest height, I took her to the creek for water. The ice rim around the edge looked like glass, trying to remember being alive. The stream moved slow, careful not to wake winter too soon. She knelt, cupped her hands, drank slow, eyes half closed. Then she filled both buckets, steady and sure. "You were not born for fences," I said. She glanced up, chin glistening with cold water. "Nor you," she answered. "Fair enough." We walked back through the brittle grass, the land brittle as an old promise. Crows followed us from the tree line, loud as guilt. Back at the cabin, she spread the water on the stove for washing. Steam rose, carrying the faint scent of pine smoke and iron. I caught her eyes following my limp the shoulder again, angry from hammer work. She said nothing, just crushed a handful of dried leaves from the pouch she kept tied to her belt. The smell juniper and sage filled the air. She pressed the poultice against the joint, her fingers warm, her silence warmer. Heat, sharp and clean, spread through. I almost thanked her, but words can make a decent thing feel smaller. She looked up once, meeting my eyes. Pain means you are still inside yourself, she said. I reckon it also means I'm getting old. That too, she said, with the faintest trace of a smile. The light outside softened into that amber hour when even the land looks tired of being wild. We sat on the porch steps, passing the last of the coffee between us. The wind carried the sound of cattle somewhere east far enough to mean safety, close enough to mean work ahead. Toward dusk, the horizon smudged into violet. Then we heard horses distant, 4 at least, maybe 5. She didn't freeze. She reached for the rifle. I liked that about her, fear shaped into purpose. We watched through the narrow window slit until the riders turned north, dust trailing behind them like ghosts ashamed of what they were chasing. They will come when moon is gone, she said quietly. Then we'll greet them in the dark. That night, we sat by the fire with the Winchester across our knees. I showed her how to sight by touch, the weight, the balance, the whisper between breath and trigger. She corrected my hold on the barrel. You forget weight, she said. Let gun rest, not fight. I laughed. The first time in months. You ever think about preaching that to men? They do not listen until it costs them. How so? And this lever did his the pander. In the God junger did desovit. Firelight cracked between us, painting her face in gold and ember. The scars on her wrists looked quieter now, like the story beneath them was ready to sleep. For a moment she wasn't a survivor or a fugitive or a memory, just a woman, whole and still. Outside, the wind changed direction. It smelled of snow, the kind that didn't fall for beauty, but for warning. She noticed, too. When it snows like this, she said, the land forgets names, even its own. Then we'll remind it, I said. When the coyotes began their far cry, long and lonely, I asked, where will you go if this ends? She looked at the flame, eyes steady. To wherever my name still means daughter. You remember where that is? She shook her head. Maybe you remember for me, she said softly. The words landed gentle and stayed. Sometimes silence is heavier than truth. Outside, the snow began thin flakes, the sky testing the idea of forgiveness. I went to bank the fire and shut the door against the wind. She moved closer, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. The firelight danced in her hair, catching the copper glint of embers, and for a breath she looked like something sacred the world had almost forgotten. We talked a little after that, not about danger or escape, but small things, what snow sounded like on pine needles, what dreams meant to people who'd stopped believing in them. Do you ever dream? She asked. Not lately. Then maybe I dream for both of us. There is on some the dive flans of the word in what of the long and liver, the 2 man daron, and no thousand sing whether K's, and fact with flans and with thous, and self is of his last foreign fins. And so the 2 minutes have stayed very too, and there are comment and dus, and to a day darrow of the fland. Her voice carried something between promise and prayer. The wind grew quiet after midnight, the kind of quiet that makes you think the world's holding its breath, listening. I cleaned the rifle, set it beside the door, and sat with my back against the log wall. Ayanna stretched out by the fire, her eyes half-lidded, watching the flames the way some folks watch confession. You can sleep, I said. So can you. I've tried. She smiled without looking at me. Then stop trying. The last May's bein' like, for the first time since the war, I didn't need to keep the rifle close. I still did, but I didn't need to. Somewhere outside, a branch cracked under the snow. Not a threat, just the land shifting its weight. The cabin breathed. The wind sighed. The world, for once, seemed willing to let us rest. When I finally closed my eyes, I dreamed of open fields without fences, of rivers running clear through country no one had yet claimed. In that dream, she was walking ahead, leaving tracks the snow refused to cover. And in the dream, for the first time in a long while, I wasn't following anyone, I was walking beside her. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. 2 nights later we rode to Red Ford. The ledger under my coat felt heavier than any gun. Pike Lathrop's name sat in that book like a rattlesnake coiled on the word law. The kind of page you can't turn without feeling fangs. Ayanna rode the roan. I took the mule in silence. The moon was a thin coin, same color as the one I'd spent to buy nothing and everything. Red Ford slept behind its fences and lies, the freight lamps dim as dying stars. At the saloon we found the barkeep again, the woman with arms like good timber. She didn't smile this time. She handed me a key wrapped in paper. "Back lot, building 3. You didn't get this here." "Wouldn't dream of it," I said. The freight yard was colder than the inside of a church bell. We moved through stacks of crates marked Chicago Meats and Benson Exports. The lock on the cold barn looked new. I fit the key, turned once, twice. The door sighed open and breathed frost. Inside, the dark had weight. Lantern light found rows of wooden boxes packed with straw and movement under one tarp. Ayanna lifted it, slow. A girl blinked up at us, skin gray from cold, breath weak. 2 more behind her, alive, barely. "We take them," Ayanna whispered. "All of them," I said. We loaded the wagon, layering blankets, whispering names. Most didn't have any. She spoke to them in Cheyenne, soft, steady sounds that made the air warmer. Comfort doesn't need translation. By dawn we reached the ridge above the creek. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney, a small, stubborn flag that said, "Safe for now." The rescued women lay near the fire, shaking but breathing. I'd seen soldiers die with less will. Ayanna moved between them with that stillness. Medicine requires checking pulse, feeding broth, rubbing life back into fingers gone blue. She looked younger doing it, or maybe just closer to what she'd been before the world got sold crooked. When I stepped outside, frost bit the air sharp as metal. 3 riders showed on the ridge, Pike's men. They spotted me, turned, and rode back toward town. They'd fetch him. The next time, it would be for keeps. I cleaned the Winchester, checked the spare rounds. The weight of the rifle felt right again, like an old sin forgiven by repetition. Inside, Ayanna said, "You plan to kill him. I plan to make him stop needing to breathe near honest people. That is still killing. The pest of looting de bed had not bees for him. Sometimes that's the name of mercy." She didn't argue. She just handed me a small pouch of gray powder. "Rub this on the barrel after you fire. Hides the smoke. My grandfather hunted men who hunted him." I took it, nodded. "Then your grandfather and I might have gotten along." Evening fell like a bruise. The women slept, exhausted. Ayanna and I waited by the fire, neither of us talking much. Outside, the snow began again, fine and deliberate. The world sounded padded, like everything dangerous was just catching its breath. When I finally spoke, my voice felt like it came from far away. "That ledger's enough to hang Pike twice." She didn't look up. "Paper is not rope." "Maybe not, but it points to the neck." At midnight, I saddled the mule. "If I'm not back by sunrise, burn that book." She rose. "Then the proof dies too." "Better the proof than you." She stepped close, the firelight painting her face in amber and ash. "You go to stop a man from taking more lives. That is not killing. That is closing a door." I didn't answer. There are words that lose strength when spoken, and duty's one of them. Red Ford looked half dead when I rode in just lanterns swaying above shuttered windows. The saloon door creaked like it recognized me. Pike was there. Same hat, same grin, with the corners filed to cruelty. "I heard you've been asking about ledgers," he said. I laid the book on the table. "Not asking, reading. That heaven given son, 7 fast and have a many worktas, and the parent held 7's eyes, and dead a flash, and the posy was lifted, the probably some of the decked, of the cause, and the parent acted comparat, and the parent held 9, And the team stage today's. He flipped it open, eyes flicking. You don't understand business. I understand theft wearing Sunday clothes. His hand went under the table. I was faster. The Winchester barked once, the smoke barely showed. His chair toppled, he stayed down. The barkeep froze behind the counter, then nodded once, something like a prayer that justice had found its way home. I took the ledger and walked out. The street was empty, but for the echo of boots and snow falling like small white truths. By the time I reached the ridge, the world had gone quiet again. Ayanna waited by the gate, lantern high. The rescued women were awake inside, their voices soft as wind through reeds. She looked at me, then at the rifle. Done? Done enough. Then let them live now, she said. I set the rifle by the door, feeling the ache in my shoulder hum like an old hymn. The cabin smelled of broth, smoke, and something gentler, safety maybe. The women slept side by side near the fire. One stirred, muttered a name that didn't belong to her anymore. Ayanna brushed the hair from her face. They will remember, she whispered, even if it hurts. I sat down beside the hearth, letting the warmth crawl through the cold places inside me. Outside, the snow kept falling, slow, steady, clean. When dawn came, it painted the windows gold. The land looked washed new, as if the night had done some quiet bookkeeping of its own. The ledger lay open on the table, pages fluttering in the draft. Beside it, Ayanna placed a feather from her pouch, soft and gray. For balance, she said. I looked at her, then at the fire. You believe in balance? I believe the land keeps score, she said. We only help it remember. The rescued women began to stir, weak but alive. I poured coffee and passed it around. No one thanked anyone. It wasn't that kind of morning. Gratitude here wore silence and breath. Outside, crows gathered in the bare cottonwoods, black against the pale sky. I watched them lift at once, wheeling toward the west, the same direction Pike had once owned. Ayanna stood beside me, her shadow long across the snow. What now? She asked. Fence needs fixing, I said. Always does. She smiled, small and honest. Then we start there. And just like that, the world, battered, scarred, and still turning, felt almost possible again. Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. Your body will thank you. I knew they'd come with daylight. Men like Pike always wanted witnesses when they meant to win. The kind of men who liked their cruelty bathed in sunlight, so no one could pretend not to see it. I was outside stacking wood when I heard the hoofbeat rhythm that says, a decision's riding your way. You can tell a lot from hoofbeats how sure a man is, how drunk, how afraid. These sounded like men pretending not to be either. I laid the axe aside, wiped my hands on my coat, picked up the Winchester, and walked to the yard's edge. The air smelled like dust, ready to remember blood. Pike rode first, slick hat, new coat, same rot underneath. He had that grin of a man who thinks paperwork and pistol smoke make the same kind of law. 3 men flanked him, half drunk, half brave, and none smart enough to tell the difference. Their horses snorted steam into the cold, and the rising sun turned that breath into ghosts. Ayanna stood in the doorway behind me, rifle resting easy in her hands. The fire inside the cabin threw a small light over her shoulder, enough to make her look carved from both dusk and morning. I didn't have to tell her to stay. She already knew her place in the story, and it wasn't behind anyone. Morning, Hart, Pike called, voice bright as spoiled milk. You got something that belongs to me. Don't reckon I do, I said. The woman, the others you hauled out of my storage. That's property. You're trespassing on a man's business. Selling people isn't business, I said. It's rot with a price tag. He smiled, slow. World's full of rot, friend. Only question is who's profiting. I reckon that's what separates a man from a maggot, I said. Pike chuckled, low and greasy. You talk big for someone standing in front of half my payroll. Payroll? I raised the rifle. Seems to me all you've paid for is a shallow grave. His grin faltered. You think you're the law out here? No, I said. But I remember what it used to look like. He looked past me to Ayanna, sneering. You really think a fence mender and an Injun squaw can take down a town? She's Cheyenne, I said, and she's freer than you'll ever be. That hit him where pride keeps its whiskey. He yanked his pistol. I fired before his aim found a thought. The shot clipped his shoulder and spun him sideways. His horse screamed, reared, and threw him into the dirt. The other men pulled iron, scattering wide. I dropped one in the thigh before he cleared his sight. Ayana's rifle barked behind me, a sound like final judgment, and another man folded to the ground, cursing in a language made of panic. The last one decided courage was overrated and ran for the ridge, coattails flapping like surrender. Smoke hung blue and still, curling upward into the pale air. Pike tried to sit, one hand clamped over his wound, blood seeping through his fingers like ink on paper. "You'll swing for this," he hissed. "Maybe," I said, lowering the rifle. "But you'll bleed first." He spat into the dirt. "You don't understand how this works. You kill me, another'll take my place." "Maybe," I said again, "but he'll think twice about sitting that seat." Behind me, I heard boots on frost measured, official boots, not Pike's kind. The marshal stepped from the trail, coat unbuttoned, rifle easy across his arm. He looked older than yesterday, like conscience had added years overnight. His face carried that quiet, sort of tired, that comes from finally deciding which side to stand on. "Morning, Pike," he said. "Got your handwriting here on half a dozen ledgers. Care to testify against yourself?" Pike's face went white. The way a man looks when he realizes the trap he built is now under his own feet. The marshal's deputy rode up with two federal men from Dodge, clean coats, government eyes, and the slow patience of people who sign warrants instead of duels. Paper had done its quiet work while we weren't looking. I'd slipped the ledger to the barkeep the night before, tucked in a sack of flour. She'd given it legs faster than any bullet. Pike stared at me, eyes bright with something between hate and surprise. "You set me up." "No," I said. "You wrote your own gallows." "One review right." The marshal nodded to the deputies. "Take him alive." That felt right. Death would have been too clean for Pike. He needed to stand under the sky he'd polluted and hear the sentence read in daylight. Some men deserve to rot where everyone can see them go soft. They loaded him into a wagon. His wounded men followed, limping and swearing. The wind picked up, scattering the smell of gunpowder with something cleaner, pine smoke maybe, or the faint trace of peace. By noon, Red Ford gathered at the courthouse square. Folks who'd looked away yesterday looked ashamed today, which is the first step toward better. The women we'd rescued were there, wrapped in blankets, staring at nothing and everything at once. Ayana stayed beside the wagon, quiet, watchful, her hand never far from the rifle. When the marshal read the charges, Pike barely listened. He was pale, sweating, but not repentant. His kind never were. The crowd was silent, the way people get when they realize they've been part of something dirty just by not stopping it. When it was over, I walked Ayana back to the horses. The sun hung low and wide, bleeding through the dust, painting the town in rust and remorse. "It's done," I said. "Not done," she answered, "but better." Her voice was soft, but the kind that could move stones. She mounted the roan bareback, her braid tied with a strip of cloth one of the rescued women had given her. I held her stirrup without thinking. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Same as before," I said. "Fix what's broken." She studied me a long time. "The land breaks faster than hands can mend." "Then it'll keep me busy," I said. A small smile ghosted across her lips. "You could come north," she said. "My people still remember what kindness costs." "Some debts I can't carry that far," I said. She nodded, understanding what I meant. Some roots hold a man by the ankle, and mercy doesn't always mean leaving them behind. The rescued women climbed into the wagon, 6 of them now, faces pale but alive. Ayana took the reins, her shoulders straight under the dawn. "The marshal will send word," I said. "He'll see you safe past the river." "I'll see us safe," she said simply. The roan stepped forward, and the wagon creaked after it. I watched her ride toward the ridgeline until the wheels cut their own path through the frost, bright as silver scars across the plain. When they were small against the horizon, I went back to the cabin. The fire was still burning. A pot of coffee hissed low on the stove. I poured a cup and sat on the step, watching the smoke drift through the pale morning. The yard smelled of gun oil and thawing snow. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel like punishment. It felt earned. The marshal came by later, hat in his hands. "Town's grateful," he said. "They just don't know how to say it." "I'm fine without speeches," I told him. He looked toward the ridge. "She's a good one." "She's more than that," I said. "She's proof." He nodded, not asking what kind of proof. He didn't need to. When he rode off, I stayed where I was, listening to the sound fade. A crow settled on the split rail, black against the snow. The world seemed balanced on that silence, like even the air was deciding which story to keep. I thought of the ledger now sealed in some federal box. Of Pike, sitting in his cell, probably talking about fairness like a man who'd never met it. And of Ayanna, leading those women north through the passes, her song riding the cold. I finished the coffee, tossed the dregs in the dirt, and went back to stacking the rest of the wood. The axe bit the stump clean. Honest. The sound carried a long way across the hills, the kind of sound that tells the land a man's still here, still working. The wind came up from the west, sharp but not cruel. It carried faint voices, women's laughter, maybe, or memory pretending to be merciful. Somewhere out there, Ayanna was teaching them to sing again. And the world, for once, was quiet enough to listen. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. Winter settled in honest. Snow came clean over the plains, softening everything that ever had sharp edges. The cabin creaked, but held. Smoke rose straight from the chimney most mornings, which is the prairie's way of saying you're still alive. The world turned smaller in winter, just the cabin, the roan, the fence, and the two of us trying not to vanish. Mornings began with silence and the sound of frost breaking loose from the eaves. Sometimes I'd wake to see her already outside, scarf drawn tight, scattering feed for the hens. She moved through the cold like it was something to be reasoned with, not feared. The sky above her always seemed enormous, too large for one life to fit under. We mended fence through January. The wind burned our faces red and left us laughing at how foolish survival can look. She worked beside me without complaint. When her hands blistered, she wrapped them in cloth and kept going. I wanted to tell her she didn't have to, but she already knew that and chose to anyway. At night we warmed by the stove. She'd crush sage into the fire so it smelled like dry summer and ghosts. I'd read from an old Bible, not for belief, just for the rhythm of words built to last. "The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them," I'd read, and she'd listen like she was measuring each syllable against the wind outside. Her eyes would half close, the firelight flickering in them like some language older than English. One evening she asked, "Does the land forgive what men do?" I thought about the graves, the rails, the fences that bit into earth like nails into flesh. "Maybe it just forgets," I said. She shook her head. "Forgetting is the same as dying. The land remembers. That is why it grows back." Her truth hit me clean. We let the silence stretch. The fire's crackle filled it, small, steady applause for being still here. February brought long days of gray. The wind came down off the high ridge, smelling of snow and pine pitch. We hauled water, patched the roof, and learned the slow talk of people who've run out of fear. I began to notice small things again, the click of the stove damper, the way the roan's breath rose white against dawn, how her hair caught the lamplight like smoke turning to gold. Sometimes she'd hum a tune I didn't know no words, just sound shaped like memory. Once I asked what it was. "Hey, song for finding," she said. "Finding what?" "Whatever you lost when you stopped listening." Spring started sneaking in, rivulets under snow, birds testing voices. We took down the storm shutters. I patched the north fence. She planted wild sage near the door. "It keeps snakes and sorrow out," she said, pressing the roots deep. I watched her work and realized the ground already trusted her more than it had ever trusted me. The snow thinned to crust, and the air tasted like thaw. The creek ran loud again, impatient with its own freedom. We spoke less those days, not from distance but because words had done their work. Sometimes I'd catch her looking east where the hills rose blue and far, the way people look when the heart starts tugging toward home. One morning she saddled the roan without a word. I stepped onto the porch, boots wet with thaw. The light came thin through the cottonwoods, bright enough to sting. "You leaving?" I asked. She cinched the strap, tested the girth. "I will go to the hills. My people camp near the red rock when snow melts."